After the Taliban and Al Qaeda were out of Afghanistan, what would the United States do next? Uh, Many conspiracy theorists would think that invading Iraq was the plan all along, and there is certainly a case to be made for that. Just after 9/11 had happened, and Afghanistan was pacified, and the Taliban was gone, Al Qaeda was gone. Vice President of the United States at the time, Dick Cheney, went on an American talk show called Meet the Press, and he laid the case that the United States should invade Iraq because Iraq was a sponsor of terrorist groups and that they had weapons of mass destruction that they would give to these terrorist groups, and that the United States should do everything in its power to get rid of these weapons so that they do not fall into the wrong hands. Shortly after that, George W. Bush, in his State of the Union address, gave what was called the Axis of Evil speech. And in the Axis of Evil speech, he laid the case that the United States would go to war against any country that they thought was a threat to their national security. Those countries that were listed in the Axis of Evil were Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. They would deal with Iraq first. In order to lay the case against Iraq, they needed the most credible person in their cabinet to do so, and that person was perceived to be Colin Powell. Colin Powell was a general during the first Gulf War, and he was one of the most trusted men in America. And he was the Secretary of State, and he was asked by Bush and the rest of the national security team to go to the United Nations and present the case that the United States should be given permission to go to Iraq to get rid of weapons of mass destruction. In particular, these things here were called mobile production facilities for biological agents. A lot of this information had been obtained by the CIA. This is the CIA director over here, George Tenet. And they were not, and evidence has shown this, that these things were kind of fabricated and made up by a disgruntled Iraqi agent who was just trying to get attention and money from the United States. So he made up a lot of this stuff. Stories go that Colin Powell wasn't necessarily convinced, and he felt as though he didn't have enough information to make a strong case to go to war against Iraq. But the rest of the team wanted him to do it, and he was eventually convinced to do it. But he said that if I'm going to go, I'm dragging this CIA George Tenet guy with me, and if I'm wrong, you're going to go down with me. And that's kind of ended up what's happening. It was a very compelling case, but it wasn't enough to convince the United Nations Security Council that they should go to war. The United Nations Security Council has around 22 members around the table. They all have to, not all of them have to agree, but all 5 of what are called the permanent members have to agree. The permanent members of the Security Council are France, Russia, Britain, China, and the United States. If one of them decide that they do not support a action, then the action does not happen. It's called a veto. The United States obviously wasn't going to veto their own proposal. The British were going along with the United States on this one for sure. Russia, France, and China all vetoed or threatened to veto the United States proposal or the proposal that they be given permission to go to war against Iraq. So what did the United States do instead? They just said, you know what, UN, we're not going to listen to you. We're going to do what we think we need to do to provide security for our people. The United Nations said, well, hold on. Why don't you let us send in our weapons inspectors first? The United Nations was going to send in their weapons inspectors. So they sent in this guy named Hans Blix. He was in Iraq for like 2 months or something like that, touring all of these weapons facilities, and he was given a pretty hard time by all the Iraqi officials who were claiming that they didn't have any weapons of mass destruction and that the United States didn't know what they were talking about. And Hans Blix's recommendation was that the United States did not have a case to go to war. There were no weapons of mass destruction. There's no reason for the United States to go to war. but the United States decided they were going to anyways. The United States was going to station all of their troops in Kuwait for a potential invasion unless this would happen. And there was a couple other weapons inspections that were to go on. All of this whole process took like a year and a half that the United States was trying to go to war. Now, the idea of how Canada kind of gets involved in this is pretty interesting. The United States, led by George W. Bush, had Britain's support all the way. This is Tony Blair. He was the British Prime Minister at the time, and so you would think that Canada would go along with this too, being that we have such a good relationship with the United States. That wasn't the case. Jean Chrétien took a stand on this one, and he decided he wasn't going to do it. Despite what the leader of the opposition in Canada was saying at the time, Stephen Harper, who wanted to support the United States in anything that they did. George W. Bush was devastated by, or very upset by Jean Chrétien's decision not to go to war. He, in fact, kind of slighted Canada in a way when he gave a speech saying that Britain was the United States' best friend, meaning that Canada was not. Stephen Harper was very concerned by this split between Canada and the United States at that time. And he was very much in support of a war against Iraq. And he came out in the House of Commons. Ultimately, despite this pressure, Jean Chrétien made a passionate speech in the House of Commons saying that he was not going to drag Canada into this war, that the United Nations did not support, that he didn't support. He just didn't feel like it was the right thing to do. But the United States did it anyway. So leaving their bases in Kuwait, it was pretty much a replay of what happened, 12, 13 years earlier in the first Gulf War. The United States annihilated the Iraqi military. It wasn't anywhere close with all the sophisticated military that the United States has. It wasn't a fair fight. And the United States was able to capture pretty much all of Iraq within a couple of weeks and topple Saddam Hussein's regime. This was epitomized by them dragging down a statue of Saddam Hussein in the capital city of Baghdad. They were able to capture Saddam Hussein I think it was maybe 6 or 7 months after the fall of Iraq. They found him in a hole, which you can kind of see here that American troops were doing that. Not only were they looking for Saddam Hussein, but they were looking for weapons of mass destruction as well, and they didn't find any. So it all seemed like a bit of a lie that the government was using a lot of their power for wrongful things. So they couldn't find any WMD. They did find Saddam Hussein, and they ended up hanging him a couple months later. The United States didn't have much to do with that, but they gave him to the Iraqi authorities, and they hung him a little bit later on. Iraq turned into a bit of a gong show after that. An insurgency, what's called insurgency or rebellion against American rule, soon came up, and all these different groups started attacking American troops, and literally thousands of Americans ended up dying. And even after the invasion had been successful, there were small skirmishes, improvised explosive devices. American troops were getting slaughtered at an increasingly high rate. Again, thousands and thousands of people died. Several different rebel groups were going up all around Iraq. Not only were these rebel groups fighting the United States, but they were fighting each other too. There were Shia militias supported by Iran. There were Sunni militias that were supported by Saudi Arabia and other places. Another group that was formed here was called the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, which was led by this guy named Hirz al-Karwi. That organized, although he died 5 or 6 years ago, his organization still lives on and occupies a lot of news coverage and territory in the Middle East. So what can be explained, or what can be looked at as a result of the Iraq War? Jean Chrétien was very much vindicated by this whole thing. Iraq ended up being an absolute disaster for the countries involved. Canada was not involved in this, and Jean Chrétien deserves a lot of credit for that. And George W. Bush looks like a bit of a goat, and this is a huge stain on his presidency. This mission accomplished banner is very indicative of that. He gave this speech on an American aircraft carrier. I believe it was maybe 4 or 5 weeks after the invasion had started, and he was convinced that the war was over. And so that would have been around in June or July of 2003. Iraq and the United States still has troops in Iraq today. And after this time, when the insurgency happened, thousands of more American soldiers ended up dying as a result of that. So the next chapter in the War on Terror will begin once Iraq had kind of descended into chaos. The United States was preoccupied and needed to move a lot of its troops away from Afghanistan to nation build in Iraq. And who was going to be left to help pick up some of those pieces? And that would be decided by this man here, Paul Martin.